In February of 1778, a Prussian officer with a jeweled medallion across his chest, a heavy German accent, and a small Italian greyhound trotting at his heels rides into the Continental Army's winter camp at Valley Forge, and one of the first soldiers to see him will later compare him to the ancient god of war himself. What that soldier does not yet know is that the army standing in front of this stranger can barely be called an army at all. Roughly a quarter of the men have no proper shoes. Disease is killing soldiers faster than any British musket has managed in months. And the man who has just arrived, a self-styled baron who does not speak a word of English, is about to take this starving, disorganized collection of farmers and laborers and turn it, in a matter of weeks, into the force that will eventually stand toe-to-toe with the most professional army on earth. To understand why Valley Forge needed someone like this so badly, you have to understand exactly what state the Continental Army was in the winter of 1777. After the losses at Brandywine and the fall of Philadelphia to the British, George Washington had led roughly 12,000 men into winter quarters at a defensible high plateau about 18 miles northwest of the city. What followed was 6 months of genuine catastrophe. Soldiers lived in crude log huts they built themselves, often packing a dozen men into a single small structure. Food was scarce enough that men survived for stretches on what they called fire cakes, little more than flour and water cooked on a hot stone. Roughly 2,000 soldiers would die over the course of that winter, not from combat, but from smallpox, dysentery, and exposure. One private, Joseph Plum Martin, described the army's condition bluntly: no clothing, no provisions, and as disheartened as any group of men could be. But the deeper problem, the one that would actually determine whether this army could ever fight and win again, was not just supply. It was organization. Different units had been trained under completely different systems, borrowed piecemeal from whichever European drill manual a given officer happened to have on hand. Basic formations were inconsistent from one regiment to the next. Soldiers from different states genuinely struggled to maneuver together on a battlefield because no two units had learned to move the same way. An army that cannot reliably form a line, reload in unison, or execute a coordinated retreat is not really an army. It is a large armed crowd, and a large armed crowd was exactly what stood between the Continental cause and total collapse. The man who arrived to fix this had, by his own account, an impressive resume, and by the account of most historians since, a resume that had been quietly polished along the way. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben was born in the fortress town of Magdeburg, Prussia, in 1730, the son of a military engineer, and spent part of his boyhood in Russia following his father's postings before returning to Germany for a formal Jesuit education. He joined the Prussian army himself at 17 and served through the 7 Years' War, eventually working as an aide on the general staff of Frederick the Great, one of the most celebrated and rigorously drilled military machines in Europe at the time. It was here, watching Frederick's obsessive attention to standardized drill and discipline up close, that Steuben absorbed the exact system of training he would later adapt for an army of American farmers. He was discharged as a captain in 1763 for reasons that remain unclear to this day, and for the next 12 years worked as chamberlain to a minor German court, a largely ceremonial post at a tiny principality called Hohenzollern-Hechingen, managing a petty prince's household rather than commanding troops. It was during this period, by most accounts, that he began quietly styling himself as a baron, a title whose legitimacy historians have never fully settled. By the mid-1770s, he was in real financial difficulty, and when the French Minister of War introduced him to Benjamin Franklin in Paris as an experienced officer who could bring order to the struggling American army, Steuben agreed to a deal that tells you everything about how confident anyone actually was in the American cause at that point. He would only be paid if the Americans won the war. He set sail with a small entourage, a young aide, a secretary named Pierre-Étienne Duponceau, and his beloved Italian greyhound Azar, who apparently went with him everywhere. On the way to meet Washington, Steuben's party was nearly arrested in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, because the red clothing he and his companions were wearing looked uncomfortably similar to a British uniform, a small, almost comic irony given what he was about to accomplish for the other side. By the time he reached York, Pennsylvania, where the Continental Congress had relocated after the fall of Philadelphia, arrangements had already been made for his unusual contingent pay, and he arrived at Washington's camp in February of 1778, dressed in the crisp uniform of a Prussian general, decorations and all, despite having no army left to actually command yet. Steuben arrived at Valley Forge on February 23, 1778, and whatever grand impression his uniform and jeweled decorations made on the soldiers who first saw him, his own impression of the army he had come to fix was considerably less flattering. He described the state of their weapons as horrible, covered in rust, and the men themselves as literally naked in some cases, in the most literal sense of the word. His assessment of their combat readiness was, if anything, even more damning. Inspecting the army's bayonets, he noted that the American soldier, having never really used the weapon in earnest, had no faith in it at all, and used it mainly to roast his beefsteak over a campfire rather than as a weapon of war. Steuben concluded, in his own later writing, that no European army could possibly have held together under the conditions he found at Valley Forge, and he did not waste time waiting for supplies or reinforcements to arrive before getting to work. If you're learning something from this breakdown, take a second and hit subscribe. We cover overlooked figures and turning points like this every week, and what Steuben builds over the next few months is genuinely remarkable to watch unfold. Rather than attempting to train all 12,000 soldiers at once, an impossible task for one man who did not even speak their language, Steuben selected roughly 100 men, drawn from different brigades, along with a detachment of Virginians from Washington's own lifeguard, to form what became known as a model company. He trained this smaller group personally and directly, marching alongside them in the mud rather than issuing orders from a distance, breaking down the complicated European manual of arms into a simplified sequence of steps that could be learned quickly under difficult conditions. Because Steuben spoke German and French but no English, communication was a constant, occasionally hilarious obstacle. When his frustration boiled over during drill, which happened often, he would curse at the men in French and German, and when he needed the message to actually land, he would call on Dupenso to translate his fury directly into English on the spot. By one account, Steuben would shout for his aide, telling him to come swear for him in English because these men simply would not do what he was telling them to do. The soldiers, rather than resenting this, seemed to have genuinely loved him for it. He was a nobleman, at least by his own self-description, who was willing to stand in the mud and sweat alongside enlisted farmers and laborers, correcting their footwork himself rather than simply issuing commands from horseback. Once the model company had absorbed his methods, Steuben used them as instructors to train the rest of the army, a cascading system where trained men trained others, who in turn trained still more, until the entire encampment had been brought up to a single, consistent standard within roughly 2 months. He simplified the loading and firing of a musket into a short, clear sequence of steps, rather than the sprawling, inconsistent methods different units had picked up individually. He taught soldiers to march in step using a standardized pace, watching the officer at the head of the column, rather than relying entirely on a drummer to keep everyone synchronized, a change that let entire regiments maneuver together in ways they simply could not before. He reorganized the layout of the camp itself, moving latrines away from living quarters and restructuring how units were housed by company and regiment, changes that had almost nothing to do with combat directly, but everything to do with the disease that had already killed thousands of men that winter. He also established a standardized system for how courts-martial should be conducted and clarified the specific duties expected of every rank, replacing a patchwork of informal local customs with a single army-wide standard. And he insisted, repeatedly and forcefully, that the bayonet stop being treated as a cooking utensil and start being trained as the aggressive close-quarters weapon it was designed to be, a lesson that would pay off in ways nobody at Valley Forge could have fully appreciated yet. The transformation did not take years. It took weeks. By the spring of 1778, observers who had watched the Continental Army struggle with basic formations just months earlier were describing a force that finally moved like a real army. The first real test came remarkably fast. At the Battle of Barren Hill in May, and then just 9 days after the Continental Army marched out of Valley Forge in June of 1778, it fought the British to a near standstill at the Battle of Monmouth, a battle that, months earlier, this same disorganized force would almost certainly have lost badly. Steuben himself, serving by then on Washington's own staff, was reportedly the first officer to correctly determine that the British were heading toward Monmouth at all. Steuben's training continued paying dividends well beyond that single engagement. At the Battle of Stony Point the following year, Continental soldiers executed a nighttime assault with their muskets deliberately left unloaded, relying entirely on the bayonet training Steuben had drilled into them at Valley Forge, and won the engagement outright, a complete reversal from an army that, less than 2 years earlier, had regarded the bayonet as barely worth carrying. Over the winter of 1778 and 1779, Steuben formalized everything he had built into a single written manual, Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, commonly remembered simply as the Blue Book. He drafted it in French, and Alexander Hamilton and Nathanael Greene translated it into English for the rest of the army to use. Congress formally approved it in March of 1779, and remarkably, the United States Army continued using Steuben's system as its official drill manual for another 35 years, all the way through the War of 1812. Steuben's influence did not end at Valley Forge. In 1780, he was sent south to assist Nathanael Greene, serving as an instructor and supply officer during the grinding campaign that eventually broke British control across the Carolinas, and by 1781 he commanded a division during the final siege at Yorktown, playing a direct role in the operation that ended the war. Washington also relied on Steuben's organizational skill in more mundane but equally vital ways, at one point sending him to lobby Congress directly for badly needed funding to keep the army supplied, a task that required navigating the same political frustrations that had made Greene's earlier posting as Quartermaster General such a thankless job. When George Washington wrote his final letter as commander of the army in 1783, he specifically thanked Steuben for his faithful and meritorious service, a rare and pointed acknowledgement for a foreign volunteer who had arrived at the Army's absolute lowest point with nothing but a resume of uncertain accuracy and a willingness to work for free unless the whole improbable cause actually succeeded. Steuben went on to become a founding member of the Society of the Cincinnati, the veterans organization formed by former Continental officers after the war, and despite everything he had built for the Army, his personal finances remained a struggle for the rest of his life, undone by the same taste for aristocratic display that had first led him to claim a title he may never have technically earned. What Steuben understood, arguably better than any American officer at the time, was that the Continental Army's biggest problem was never really its courage. Soldiers who would march barefoot through the snow and endure a winter that killed a sixth of their own camp were clearly not lacking in commitment. What they lacked was a shared, consistent method for turning that commitment into coordinated action on a battlefield, and Steuben, a foreigner who could not even speak their language, was the one who finally gave it to them. Valley Forge is preserved today as a National Historical Park in Pennsylvania, its rebuilt log huts standing on the same rolling ground where Steuben once marched 100 hand-picked men through drills in the mud while cursing at them in 3 languages. A statue of Steuben stands near the park today, commemorating a man most Americans have never heard of despite the fact that the discipline he built there carried the Continental Army through the rest of the war and shaped how the United States Army trained soldiers for more than 3 decades afterward. An Ohio River town later named itself Steubenville in his honor, one of several places across the country that still carry his name in some form. Standing on that same parade ground now, quiet and green, it takes some effort to picture the desperate winter that once nearly destroyed the Continental Army entirely, or the strange, profane foreign nobleman who showed up with nothing more than a translator, a dog, and a refusal to believe the situation was as hopeless as it looked. Steuben did not win a single battle himself. He built the army that won all the ones that mattered afterward. If this kind of overlooked figure is your thing, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one, and leave a comment telling us which forgotten commander or contributor you want us to cover next.